day participants. My name is Dr. Ernest Ekoja, and I will be taking you through Module 8 of the big online program for CPES that is currently ongoing. I'm a faculty member and I major in agronomy. We are going to look at 3 different areas of the course, and it entails biodiversity conservation, cultural heritage, and stakeholder engagement. So we'll look at them in those 3 components: the biodiversity and sustainable management. We'll also look at cultural heritage, and then look at stakeholder engagement. These 3 environmental and social standards of the World Bank, they are important standards which all project managers ought to get themselves acquainted with, because these are issues, practical issues you're going to face in the course of project development, management, and even as execution as well too. So we'll be looking at their definitions, the risks, and then the different components of each of these sections, and how to come up with a management plan in order to address each of these concerns of the environmental and social standards. So we're going to start first with ESS 6, which is biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources. It's important. This ESS recognizes that protecting and conserving biodiversity and sustainably managing living natural resources are fundamental to sustainable development. It also recognizes the fact that it is important in maintaining core ecological functions. We cannot be looking at the importance of some projects at the detriment of habitats, including forests and other areas of the environment that supports human life. It also addresses sustainable management of primary production and harvesting of living natural resources. It recognizes also the need to consider the livelihood of projects and affected parties, including indigenous people, whose access to or use of these biodiversities or living resources may be affected by a project. So this environmental and social standard is very important. And by the end, we expect that you'll be able to define the key concepts such as biodiversity, modified habitat, natural habitat, critical habitat, as well as invasive species. Should be able to also identify risks and impacts on biodiversity caused by human activities, and then to explore sustainable resources management with a focus on legally protected biodiversity zone and primary suppliers. So there are some definitions we'll quickly look at. And if you hear the word biodiversity, what does it mean? It simply means variability among living organisms from all sources. It could be terrestrial, it could be marine, aquatic ecosystem, and so on. So it also includes diversity within species, between species and ecosystem. So when we talk of biodiversity features, we are talking about the suite of species. It could be natural community, the ecosystem services, and ecological processes with the direct and indirect area of influence of a project. And when we talk of key biodiversity area, referring to sites supporting valuable population of critical species. And part of what this ESS focus on is primary production and harvesting of natural resources. So primary production involves the cultivating and rearing of plant and animals such as crop farming. It could be annual, perennial, and then animal husbandry, aquaculture. That is primary cultivation. Then the harvesting of natural resources. This refers to the extraction of living organisms like fish, timber, when you do deforestation, another aquatic terrestrial organism from their natural or modified ecosystem and habitat. So generally, the objective of this environmental and social standard is to protect and conserve biodiversity. Not that we want to carry out a project and at the end of the day, biodiversity is lost, the habitat is completely altered, and the rest. Then, to also apply mitigation hierarchy and precautionary approach in a project, and to promote sustainable management of living natural resources, and to support local livelihood and inclusive development. The scope generally it applies to all projects affecting biodiversity or habitat directly or indirectly, positively or negatively, or that depends on biodiversity for their success. This ESS also cover primary production and harvesting of natural, just as we say. You cultivating, and as well extracting from the environment. Then it also evaluates threats like habitat loss, invasive species, and we're going to talk about them as well as pollution. The borrower has some responsibilities here. The assessment by the borrower, whenever you have to assess biodiversity issues, you first of all identify habitat types and potential risks to their ecological function. You also consider the biodiversity areas affected. Let's say you have a big acre of land that you wish to transform maybe into a particular plantation, let's say palm plantation. You need to look at the area generally regardless of legal protection, and then characterize baseline condition proportionally to the anticipated impact. That is, first of all, you develop a biodiversity action plan for high-risk project area, and then managing biodiversity risks, and starting with scoping to identify potential impacts on important areas or resources, including transboundary risks of that particular project. Online and local tools can also be helpful as well too. And if proximity is found, an assessment to analyze specific risks using the available data is part of what the borrower ought to do in your assessment of the risks and impact on biodiversity that may be caused by that particular project you're about to go into. So the environmental assessment and social assessment is important. It identifies the habitats, global of national or global significance, the species, and also assess the critical service area provided by biodiversity and natural resources, and determine if an ecosystem, the species or services are formally or informally protected by law. Okay. And then understand the ownership. You can't just say, let's say, a forest and then get into it. The forest, what is the ownership and the usage by that particular community? And then analyze existing habitat loss, degradation over time, how much of it have been lost and how much have also been regained over time. Just watch the trend and see how your own impact can come in. If the impact of the project is going to cause a drastic one, what are the mitigation measures that you're going to put in? Then evaluate physical, biological, chemical, and hydrological risks to biodiversity resources. So at the end of the day, when you do this assessment, you are going to place values on the risks that you notice. It could be negligible, that is non-protected habitats with minimal biodiversity value. It could also be low, that is when you have common degradable habitat with low conservation significance. The risk will be minimum. Habitats locally rare, small and scattered, okay? But when it is high, habitat as supporting set of unique and threatened value, especially when there are threatened endangered species within that particular habitat, you can see the risk there is high, something that cannot be recovered. When going into such area, the risk is always high, and it's important for the project manager the borrower to take note of that. So the impacts have been categorized here. It can be a direct loss, can be hydrological loss, okay, that's have to related to water, can be an air pollutant or dust, could be noise, vibration, light, spill, and other human disturbance, could be mortality and injury from collision and entrapment in machinery. So all this needs to be taken into consideration in the course of the project development and the project life. So if we want to look at habitat, been talking about habitat. Habitat is a terrestrial, freshwater, or marine geographical unit. Okay, it could be on land, on freshwater, or marine geographical unit, or airways that support assemblage of living organisms and their interaction with non-living environment. So this particular ESS biodiversity conservation addresses all habitat issues, and could be categorized as the habitats could be categorized as the modified habitat. Those are the ones that have been altered by human activities, anthropogenic activities. Natural habitat composed of largely native species that are minimally altered, and then the critical habitat, these are high of, in fact, endangered, where you have endangered species, they are high biodiversity importance. Then we also have the legally protected international and regionally recognized areas. They have also high values as well too, which may encompass habitat in any of all of these categories. So we are going to look at each of these habitats briefly. The modified habitat can be an agricultural zone, a plantation. Of course, when you say modified, that means there is human activities there already. So when your project is going to affect those areas, just ensure minimal impact on biodiversity during project implementation. Examples of these habitats are tree plantations or perennial crops, okay, livestock pastures, okay, can also be orchards, horticultural fields. Could also involve abandoned quarries, irrigated rice fields, sewage ponds, etc. Then the natural or semi-natural habitats are the ones with minimal influence or high conservation priorities. Minimal human influence, that's man influence is not there much, especially when you get to some rainforest whereby human activities are actually very reduced. And then you have the semi-natural habitats. They are modified, but they still support biodiversity and ecosystem services. And where these natural habitats have the potential to adversely affect a project, the borrower will not implement any project-related activities unless there are no technical or financial feasible alternatives. You can only go into such area, natural area, when you don't have alternative. You know, the idea is that if you can actually bypass that place, good and fine, okay? But you can only go to the where there is no financial or technically there is no alternative to that. Then appropriate mitigation measures will have to be put in place in order to avoid grievances. Then, and even when they occur, you should be also able to address them based on the mitigation measures that you have put in place. And when residual impact remain, despite best effort to either avoid, minimize, or mitigate the impact, you also aware appropriate and supported stakeholders. Mitigation measure may include biodiversity of adhering to principles of like for like or for better. Can provide a better alternative to such communities where they are found. Then there are these critical habitats, and they may be defined as areas with high biodiversity values or importance. And this critical habitat involve endangered species generally, as listed in the International Union of Conservation of Nature. There are red lists of threatened species that are there, which can be checked out in materials that will be handed to you. Then, habitats of significance of importance to endemic or restricted range of species, and highly threatened or unique ecosystem that could be regarded as critical habits. Then project activities in critical habitats can be permitted only if there is no visible, viable alternatives and where legal and international approval processes are followed. An impact will not reduce on critical biodiversity value of species. Then activities will not result in significant habitat conversion or degradation, especially if you are going to carry out deforestation in some areas and it's a critical habitat. If at the end of the day you are going to change the nature of that particular forest, is may not be permitted. Your bank may not be able to fund such a project. Then a mitigation strategy ensure net biodiversity for critical habitat values. Then you must set up mitigation strategy for that. Then long-term biodiversity monitoring and evaluation program must also be integrated into that project management too. And all mitigation strategies outlined in the biodiversity management plan. So protected areas of biodiversity values. These are clearly defined geographical space managed for conservation, and they could include World Heritage Sites, the Biosphere Reserves, individual community protected areas, and which are classified as critical. So the goal here is that areas under official processes for protection, they are critical and should be protected, and they are protected by law. So those are the protected areas of high biodiversity. Then we have the high conservation value areas. Habitat essential for uh, these red list species are the critically endangered and endangered, vulnerable, and near threatened species or areas. So the importance evaluated based on habitat's role in species production, feeding, as well as migration. So the species abundance was documented over time to determine the site importance. Then we have biodiversity offset and mitigation. This is an important part of this environmental and social aspect. Project causing significant conversion and degradation of critical natural habitat will not be financed by the World Bank. I've said this. And then alternatives must be explored to avoid such impact. Secondly, for projects with minor residual impact on critical habitat, offset can be considered to achieve no set of laws on net gain biodiversity. Then significant residue impact on non-critical habitats after applying mitigation and conducting cost-benefit analysis require compensation or offset to ensure no net loss. For projects affecting critical natural habitat without significant degree, management plan must demonstrate full mitigation of potential impacts. So there are these organisms called the invasive alien species. They are not native to a particular environment, but when they come in, they multiply so fast because their natural enemies are not within that particular environment, so they multiply very fast and they can take over the biodiversity. In fact, they are threats to biodiversity, and they can outcompete or destroy the native biodiversity. So prevention measures, just avoid international introduction without proper regulation. The regulation here can be quarantine services, especially when you are bringing a species from another environment, it has to pass through quarantine services to avoid this. Then conduct risk assessment to mitigate accidental introduction and eradicate invasive species in area if feasible and if noticed. They are very important to be removed. So sustainable management of living resources include the primary production aspect, forestry, the fishery aspect, and then the farming aspect of it. And the preparation of a biodiversity action plan is an important component. It should include the scope, the objective, the legal framework, baseline diversity data, and measurable targets. Should include also the integration of environmental and social management systems, and also monitoring, evaluation, and capacity building for implementation. This is just to ensure effective mitigation, compensation, and biodiversity conservation efforts. We'll quickly look at cultural heritage, which is the second environmental and social standard that we're going to discuss in this model. And this ESS recognizes that cultural heritage provides continuity. It can be intangible and intangible from between the past, the present, and the future. Cultural heritage set out measures. This ESS set out measures to protect cultural heritage throughout the project cycle. Why is this important? By the end, we are expected to define cultural heritage, the key objective, and to explain components of cultural heritage management plan and its confidentiality requirements to be able to recognize specific types of cultural heritage, including archaeological sites, built heritage, natural features, most valuable heritage, and commercial use heritage. So the objective of this environmental and social standard, the cultural heritage, is to protect cultural heritage from adverse impact of projects, activities, and support its preservation. The bank discovered that sometimes when projects are carried out, it's possible projects get into sites whereby there are cultural heritage, things that ought to be protected for the present and also for the future. So for those sites, they are important to the environment, and their importance at times the locals they take it serious. Like let's say getting to let's say a project is going to be carried out in a place with spiritual significance, whereby people to an area where people consider as a shrine, where their deity is being placed, and they go there to worship. No matter the importance of the project you are bringing in to help that particular community, if you don't address the cultural heritage people, these are things that are passed over from generation to generation. It's considered as a worship site. And then because it's a project that is bringing development to the area, you come and bulldoze that place. It will lead to serious conflict. So part of the idea of the bank is to ensure that to address cultural heritage as an integral aspect of sustainable development and to promote meaningful consultation with stakeholders regarding cultural heritage, and also to promote equitable sharing of benefit from the use of cultural heritage. The scope encompasses those ones that are tangible and the ones that are not, the ones you could handle and the ones that are just ideas that are passed over from one generation to the other. The key requirement is applies regardless to legal protection or prior identification. Intangible heritage is considered if physical project impact on commercial value use is involved. And then mitigation hierarchy is also an aspect. Avoid impacts, then minimize them or compensate if avoidable. So the hierarchy is, first of all, can you avoid that particular area of cultural importance where where you have some of these cultural tangible or intangible cultural heritage? Is it possible to avoid them? Can it be minimized? The impact on those areas, can it be minimized? And if it cannot, then you just have to compensate. Then we'll look at cultural heritage management plan. They are required when impacts are this identified. There is what we call the chance find procedure. The chance find procedure, that is unanticipated while carrying out your survey, maybe the scoping, you then find out that there are areas of cultural, that you discover cultural heritage during the project activities. The key component of the chance find procedure include, first of all, you do an advanced survey and monitoring. Okay. Then you do temporal work stoppage. The work will need to stop because you discovered something that is potentially and it's significant. That is potentially significant. Then you have to then carry out protection measures. Then the contractor code of conduct have to also be activated. Then the intervention protocol defines step by step appropriate response to this discovery. Then the monitoring system is important. Then coordination with other authorities. For instance, maybe while carrying out a project, road construction, you discovered a lost city underground. That part, you have to follow this intervention, the code of conduct, the interventions, the monitoring system, all of them have to be carried out in order to ensure that there is no problem at the end of the day. So we have the consultation and confidentiality, which is an important aspect. Identify cultural and its value, then you address conflict and mitigation measures that may be associated with you. There are specific types of cultural heritage, and there are the legally protected cultural areas, the archaeological sites, okay, and material. Then you have the built heritage, you have the natural features with cultural significance, then the movable cultural heritage, like the sculptures and the rest. Then the commercial use of, and then the commercial use cultural heritage. The requirements for protected areas, the borough should ensure compliance with both local and international laws. You consult managers and affected communities and promote conservation goals. For archaeological site, may require documentation. You have to do excavation, and also the ownership will also be determined by the international law. For the built heritage, these are historical structures or settlements of architectural, cultural, or spiritual value. It can be a shrine, it can be something that was used in so BC that particular place we want to preserve. Documentation, conservation, relocation while preserving authenticity is also important. Then we have the natural features such as the sacred landscape, forest, caves. Okay, it can also be protected. There are movable heritage like manuscripts, okay, let's say scrolls, and then sculptures, artifacts that can be moved. They are classified under the movable heritage. The borough should ensure and inform relevant authorities when you come across such during project implementation. Then commercial use, borough should also ensure meaningful consultation and equitable benefit sharing and mitigation of impact. The cultural management plan is this an important aspect in order for your project to go through. The components, you need the legal framework, and then the roles and responsibilities of stakeholders that are going to be involved in the project, the mitigation measures that you set in place for project integration, the implementation schedules, the budget, the monitoring, then the supporting, the reporting requirements. So finally, we'll look at the last environmental and social standard, which is stakeholder engagement and information disclosure. For me, this is one of the most important environmental and social standards that the World Bank put in place, because here stakeholder engagement is important. ESS10 is the last environmental and social standards that we're going to discuss today. and it involves stakeholder engagement and information disclosure. Personally, I feel this is one of the most important environmental and social standards of the World Bank because it recognizes the importance of open, transparent engagement between the borrower and the project stakeholder as an essential element of good international practice. It also, for effective stakeholder engagement, it can improve the environment and social sustainability of a project. It also enhances project acceptance and make significant contribution to successful project design and implementation. So this is an important ESS. And by the end, it's expected that we should be able to define stakeholder engagement and the process of information disclosure to identify and analyze stakeholder and their roles in project development. Also be able to emphasize the importance of stakeholder identification and proactive engagement, to also understand the steps for preparing and implementing a stakeholder engagement plan, develop strategies for managing grievances effectively. Why is this important? Because it allows one to ask for and receive diverse views regarding project design, implementation risks, impact, and mitigation measures. It also helps to develop strong, constructive, and responsive relationship with people impacted by a particular project, and can support project supervision, help identify potential environmental and social issues early, and can improve the environmental and social sustainability of a project in the project acceptance and also its outcome, and contribute successfully to project design and implementation. So the stakeholder engagement and information in disclosure, what should you do? First of all, during the preparation, identify, analyze, and consult stakeholders, both those that are in the project affected, party, and then those that are other interested parties. Early, especially those who might be vulnerable. Then create a draft of the stakeholder engagement plan based on insight received during that particular consultation. Then disclose the draft of the stakeholder engagement plan, gather feedback from stakeholders, and this can be done during a meeting. Revise or several meetings with them, then revise the draft based on stakeholders' feedback that you've gotten. Then send the feedback of your stakeholder engagement plan for World Bank approval. Then disclose the full stakeholder engagement before appraisal. The updated version of the stakeholder engagement plan can be redisclosed later, for example, following further consultations. Then, during the implementation phase, which is also important, implement the stakeholders engagement activities that outlined in your stakeholder engagement plan throughout the project's life cycle. Consider any revision, addition, update to the stakeholder engagement plan where they are necessary, especially when there are new stakeholders, the design changes, or stakeholders' feedback. When you get some changes regarding to stakeholders' feedback, the design, or you have new stakeholders, you can consider update of the stakeholder engagement plan. Then check if the stakeholder engagement activities are effective. The feedback channel, is it working? Are the vulnerable people engaging? Is the budget being disbursed? Then report on stakeholder implementation is also very important, especially data on grievances, and then arrangement to report back to the stakeholders. So in identifying the stakeholder, this stage is very important. The stakeholders can be broken down into this. You have the project affected parties, those that directly the project will affect, and then the other interested parties. The more specific the stakeholder categories are, the better. So you need to really understand the different groups and interests, influence, position, and concerns. In a particular community, you may have those that the project will directly affect and others that are just interested in getting something out of the project. All those ones, their needs, their influence, their interests need to be taken into consideration and to determine how to engage and manage them, especially and look at their expectations. It is also important to disaggregate and analyze the stakeholders into much detailed form as possible. For example, different stakeholder categories may include individuals, household, landowners, businesses, print media, online media, academia, think tanks, the NGOs, the CBOs, labor unions. All these are stakeholders that if necessary, you need to disaggregate and look at their concerns as concerning the project before you can actually get into project implementation. There are many differences between local level, regional level, and national actors. So these have to be taken into consideration. And then it is also useful to distinguish between people normally considered as vulnerable people and those that may be vulnerable due to the projects, especially those living directly where the project has been sited. Let's say it's a cement company, those that are living within that area, that are exposed to the dust from the cement factory. Those people can be considered as vulnerable to uh, the aftermath or the health issues that may come out of consistent inhaling of those dust. So account for the type of vulnerability and the engagement measures accordingly. And this is a hierarchy, a table that uh, could explain that further. Engaging disadvantaged and vulnerable people. Use facilitators. Important. Intermediate to connect with vulnerable, especially where there is even language barrier. Remove participation barriers by ensuring access to information and consultation. The World Bank directive clearly states that identify disadvantaged and vulnerable groups when preparing, identifying your stakeholder, implement tailored measures for their inclusion, document their involvement in preparing your stakeholder engagement plan. So the World Bank want to see all that when you are coming up with your stakeholder engagement, especially this vulnerable or disadvantaged group. People that may not have the zip power to talk to high powers that will directly affect the approval of the project. How much did you go in your disaggregation of your stakeholder in order to reach out to these people and to address their concern is an important aspect of that. So in preparation of a stakeholder engagement plan, these are the components. You have the introduction, the description of the project. You need to also give a summary of previous stakeholder engagement activities, if any. Okay, and then stakeholder identification and the analysis. You also have to show the stakeholder engagement program, including strategy for information disclosure that you have planned to carry out. The resource and responsibilities. Okay, who is going to do this? Who is going to implement this within the project cycle? The human resource aspect, the financial resource aspect, and how the stakeholders engagement activities will be budgeted. Then this aspect is important. The grievance mechanism. How will people be able to give feedback, voice possible concern about the project? The monitoring and the reporting, how is it going to be done? This is an important aspect of the stakeholder engagement plan. The technique for the stakeholder engagement plan is being shown below. You can look carefully at it and it will give you detail on how to remain passive, to monitor, to inform, and to consult, collaborate, and then empower as the cases may come up during the project cycle. You also structure your stakeholder engagement plan to showcase the target stakeholders, the topic of engagement that was raised during the stakeholder information gathering process. Is it land acquisition, assistance, compensation? Is it resettlement plan? Is it grievance processes? Then the methods you are going to use, is it through meetings, training, workshops? All those need to be highlighted carefully in your stakeholder plan. The location and the frequency, then the responsibilities, as well as what the project implementation unit are going to do, and so on and so forth. All these need to be shown in your stakeholder engagement plan. This tip for stakeholder: adapt stakeholder engagement activities to project phase. Specify the frequency of engagement and communication with different stakeholder groups. Get agreement from the project implementation unit on who will be responsible, what aspect of the stakeholder information and engagement and information disclosure. This aspect is very important. This is the grievance mechanism. In a brief overview, it is a system of receiving, because in a way, if a project is going to be handled in a particular environment and grievances are not handled, the project may be of great importance to the livelihood of people that are directly the beneficiaries, but at the end of the day, those grievances can bring about a big disadvantage for the project. And it can even lead to litigation, which the World Bank will always want to avoid. So the grievance mechanism is an important aspect of the stakeholder engagement plan activities. It is a system of receiving, addressing, and resolving complaints or suggestions related to the project and ensuring timely redress for affected parties. It also tailored the project context, scale and beneficiary, and as well as resources, cultural norms, and then technological constraint. The key features is just for accessibility. Okay, easy to understand procedures, clear timelines, and free of charge, inclusive nature of vulnerable people. The advantage of grievance redress mechanism is that it helps maintain good development conditions. They feel conducive, harmonious, uh, sustainable development is important for a project growth. It minimizes the risks of violent or otherwise destructive behavior during projects and help protect the most vulnerable people and individuals within the project area and alleviate the risks of dispute and conflict escalation. So the provision of grievance mechanism is important. Grievance mechanism is required under various environmental and social standards proportionate to the project risks and impact. The key media posts. How many grievances have been resolved and how fast? So there are general guidelines also, especially when you have issues like a pandemic or a situation whereby people are restricted in their movement. How do you handle stakeholder engagement under such? We'll conclude with that. Access to potential general guidelines, access to potential risks of virus transmission while conducting virus engagement activities. You ensure that the project implementation unit members have details understanding required on social and good hygiene practice like during the COVID-19 period, and have alternative communication and engagement mechanisms. It can be through social media, online channels, have smaller meeting if permitted, conduct consultation in small groups, and ensure that in-person events are preceded by articulating the required social hygiene practices, and then employ traditional channels of communication. That's generally you should just reduce the in-person meeting and use other alternative sources of communication when holding your stakeholder engagement activities. Thank you for your patience and for your attention.